I've been doing a lot of reading about the Heritage Foundation, and I am learning so much about these fuckers. So the Heritage Foundation was formed in 1973 by three white men. Wayrick Fulner, that fucker that just died, rest in piss, by the way, and Coors, who was the grandson of the great Coors Beer Company. And hey, as a side note, Coors definitely supports the Heritage Foundation, so fuck that company and don't drink that beer. Anyway, those assholes started that in 1973 to basically just promote white agenda and white male supremacy. Now, of course, they weren't going to come out and say that. They had used fancy words like, promoting business and promoting the economy and the betterment of the United States of America, and using conservative thinking to shrink government and increase corporate power. Which, of course, is just a fancy way of saying they wanted to push the agendas of white wealthy men and make everybody else insignificant. But one of the things that they didn't foresee is that they were going to be really fucking good at it, and it was going to end up fucking destroying them. Okay, so they found themselves as a small think tank and then get funding from like private donors. And then a couple years later, some other assholes said, hey, why don't we take these concepts and why don't we put them into a fucking book? That way we can distribute this information and get other people on board with our vision. So then we have three new assholes that enter the chat. Eckerd, he was the head of Eckerd Drugs, which is like a CVS back then. I'm sure you guys have all seen that, or you remember seeing Eckerd Drugs. He was the guy. So he was a businessman, a white businessman who was very successful in buying up stores and, building out his Eckerd drug brand. The other guy was Kreibel, and he was the head of the Loctite Corporation. And you see this like if you go to Home Depot or Ace Hardware, you see Loctite everywhere. They sell like glue and adhesives and stuff. And then the third guy was this guy, Heatherly, who was an advocate for small businesses. Interestingly enough, he ran the Small Business Association under Reagan, the SBA that they're trying to completely cut and gut and get rid of. Because why support small businesses when you can support big corporations? But I digress, because in the late 70s, early 80s, they were all about promoting businesses owned by white men. So then the first person to get their hands on the first copy or first edition of the Mandate for Leadership was Ronald Reagan. Even though they presented it to Carter, Carter was like not impressed with it whatsoever. I don't even think that he looked at it. And Reagan said, hey, this makes sense to me. If you give more money to corporations and bigger tax cuts to corporations, then corporations can grow, and that will increase the job market, and that money will eventually make itself down to the people or the workers. And of course, Reagan, because he was a white man in the early 80s, I'm sure that he was fucking racist too. I mean, I don't even think that that's up for debate, to be honest with you. But I don't think that he promoted the trickle-down economy because he thought that that was going to crash the fucking American economic system. I think he really truly thought that that was going to work. And of course it didn't, because then there was like Black Monday and all that other shit, but I don't have time to talk about it in this video. But there were other things in this Mandate for Leadership that were also being promoted in the very first edition. And one of those other things was increased defense spending. So the United States up until this point had defense spending, but they didn't have, it wasn't as exorbitant as it is today. And one of the major backings of the Heritage Foundation has always been to increase defense spending, which I didn't know until I started digging into it. And by increasing defense spending, you are going to create more business opportunities for companies to contract out to the Department of Defense. Basically, just this unlimited, amount of money that's given to the Department of Defense that other American companies can now become, involved with. In other words, the Department of Defense became a huge customer for big companies. Companies, for example, like Loctite, that have military contracts. So basically, bumping up the military spending was just to promote businesses and essentially their own businesses. Okay, so now we have exorbitant military spending that, money doesn't really have to be reported. It can be lost or used for money laundering because no one really knows where any of this money goes. And that's just kind of like what we're accepting now. But then one of the other things that was really adamant on was keeping women home. And of course, it was really important for them to keep women home because white men are terrified of women. Like, we can outsmart them and outrun them and outpace them, and that scares them. So in order to maintain control of white male power, they of course have to suppress other people of color, and they also have to suppress women. And women of color like myself, or black women, or brown women, or any other women of color are the biggest threat to them. So they had to, of course, keep brown women pregnant, which they did really fucking well. And of course, a lot of this was a direct impact of Roe v. Wade being passed. That really pissed them off. So they said, listen, if we can't keep women from getting abortions, we're just going to make sure that they just keep on getting pregnant. And the best way to do that is to keep them uneducated and keep them at home. Now, this was, of course, a time when female empowerment was becoming very popular in the United States. Women started wearing suits. Women started making it up the ladder into corporations. They really hated that. And they've been working ever since then to overturn Roe v. Wade, which of course just happened. Because having women in the workforce makes them more independent, which makes them less dependent on men. And when women are less dependent on men, then men are unable to have full control. Which is why now the current Heritage Foundation has gone after the Small Business Association. Because the Small Business Association was responsible for giving loans to small businesses that were owned by women and minorities. The one thing that the two things that they really hate. But here's where the Heritage Foundation is going to self-implode now, because they have done such a good job at bypassing anti-monopoly laws, at finding loopholes to create gigantic corporations and gigantic businesses, and by pushing out small businesses and real fair capitalism. So now they've essentially made it impossible for women to stay home. Even if women wanted to stay home, the American family can't economically afford that. So now they have two very opposing issues going on. They want women pregnant. They had Roe v. Wade overturned. They want women to stay home. They want girls going to college just to meet men, Charlie Kirk. They want all of these things, but they've created an economy where that's absolutely impossible. Because they didn't really think this through. They didn't think through the economic burden that putting all that money into corporations and giving them huge tax cuts was going to create. We are no longer a country that has a balanced budget. We are no longer a country that can afford to buy things. We are a country that is severely in debt, not only on a national level, but on a family home level as well. American debt levels are going up, and the debt is being used not to necessarily buy things that we want, but things that we need, like gasoline and food. And it's only going to get worse under this administration, which means that more and more women are going to have to get to work, which means that more and more women are going to take severe care and caution to not get pregnant because of these anti-abortion laws, which means that fertility is going to be on a massive decline, which is going to essentially hurt corporations, because corporations can steal from the people all they want, but who are they going to steal from when their source, the people, starts running low? And when the financial abilities of those people start running low, there's nobody else to feed on. The milk cow has gone dry. You can't have ideals where you want to give money to billionaires and millionaires and also want to keep women at home. It doesn't work that way. And there are a lot of other issues too, like the drugs that they dropped into Black communities to try to wipe out Black communities and keep them powerless have now gone into affluent white communities as well. Everything is literally backfiring. None of this plan is working anymore. And they've adjusted the plan to try to work with the times, but every time they adjust it, it becomes more extreme, and it amplifies the issue 10 times over. So while the Heritage Foundation is incredibly powerful because of all the money that they bring in and all the influence they have in politics, it's not sustainable. And I really think at the end of the day, what's going to happen is you're going to have dog eating dog now, because you're going to have these giant corporations. Like right now, there's 600 billionaires in the United States, and 90% of those billionaires are men, and they're going to have to start eating each other because, when the minnows run out, the sharks have to start eating the sharks. I'm still doing a lot of research, and I'm teaching myself about the Heritage Foundation, but that's what I picked up on so far. I think it's going to self-implode.